All right, welcome back to Open Bible, Open Life. I'm Pastor Kyle, and today I have Walker Armstrong with me. Walker, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Kyle.
Well, you know this, but many of our audience will not know this. When I moved to Winston-Salem, way back, it feels like a long time ago to me, in 2016, one of the first people in Winston that I did not know that reached out to me via Facebook message was Walker Armstrong. At the time, what was your official title? Something of the PMBA.
Yeah, Executive Director of the PMBA.
Executive Director of the PMBA. I want to hear a little bit more about your life than just that. But at the time, you were leading an entire, maybe the best way to explain to our audience is like a ministry to churches, a lot of times coming alongside smaller churches, older churches, revitalizing them, helping them. Anyway, I just have always been grateful for the way that you welcomed us to the city, helped us get connected. Early on, the PMBA was a big financial supporter of us, and in the past, we've been able to, I don't know if you say pay some of that back, but give some of that back. So, But I want to talk a little bit about you because we're going to get into talking about suffering and sickness and healing and chronic pain and not always the most fun stuff to talk about. So let's first talk about, how did you get to Winston-Salem? You went to Wake Forest University. Was it Wake Forest College at the time?
Oh my gosh.
Talk to me about what year is this?
Yeah, I'm not that old, man. I came in 1980.
Okay.
And I actually transferred from App.
I didn't know this part of it.
I did. And my dad was a Duke graduate, and so he wanted me to go to a high-end university, and we found a way for me to transfer.
Great. What year is this? Sophomore, junior?
1980, my sophomore year.
Sophomore year. Okay, so 1 year at App, 3 years at Wake.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so I came here. I had come to Christ a year earlier at the end of my senior year in high school, and got really deeply involved with Campus Crusade for Christ. They had a really strong chapter at App.
Okay.
And the idea was to start a chapter of Campus Crusade, now Cru, at Wake, and we ran into all kinds of problems with that. But
do they have a chapter?
They do now.
Okay.
I understand they do now. But they had a big IV chapter there and a big Baptist Student Union. But I came and I got immediately plugged into Calvary Baptist Church. Started working with
under the ministry of Mark Quartz, Dr. Mark Quartz,
who became my mentor, and worked with the youth ministry initially. Yeah. We had like 700 kids on roll.
Is this why you were at Wake? You're working in the youth ministry?
I was at Wake. Okay. Mm-hmm. And then, and that's, my life really kind of through that connection to Calvary really kind of unfolded. Yeah. In a lot of ways.
Yeah, you ended up, you've done so many things in your life, lots of things in business, marketplace, you're an entrepreneur, but you did spend a lot of time in full-time vocational ministry.
I did.
You've planted 2 different churches, one in Atlanta.
Yeah, just south of Atlanta, correct.
Atlanta's so massive. Where in Atlanta?
Yeah. Like it's a Jonesboro Stockbridge area right off of I-75.
Okay. So and then where else did you end up pastoring?
I planted another church in the Cary area, Providence Baptist. When David Horner was there, we were the first church plant of Providence.
Okay, yeah, you've told me that in the past. That's right.
And I did that. I tell people, what you need as a church planter qualifications. You need to know the Lord. Yep. And you need to have been dropped on your head when you were a baby.
those 2 things, not particularly in that order.
Yeah, not particularly in that order. Yeah. And so I planted my second church down south of Atlanta. Love doing it. Yeah. Love church planting. Yes. And, so when I was at the PMBA, now the Triad Church Network, we helped support, I think it was 8 different church plants in about a 3 or 4 year span.
I remember that period. Yeah. There seemed like a period, maybe I'm less connected now, but in Winston-Salem where there was a lot of young men, really before COVID.
Right.
That were coming in here. I'm thinking of Redemption Hill Church. I'm thinking of Emmanuel, some other churches that were coming in right at the same time to plant in Winston.
I mean, great. I'll put you as a young man back then.
I'd like to still think of myself that way sometimes.
Great young men that, were really mature. I was blown away by the maturity of guys like yourself and others, well-trained, well-connected, networked, knew, hey, we're going to hit the ground running. We're going to make disciples. And it was really exciting just to play a small part in that.
Oh, it was exciting. All right, last thing before we dive into some health stuff. Mm-hmm. You and I recently, I found out that you and I have a similar passion, not just the Lord, but golf. And I need to hear about this just for a minute. And our podcast listeners need to hear about this. You were not just a great golfer, and your dad was a great golfer, but somehow you got into long driving.
I did.
Explain this. So tell our listeners, what is this? So this is like, you were the Bryson Chambeau of like, how do you get into that? You're not necessarily a guy I would look at. I mean, you're in good shape, I'm saying, but you're not a guy I would look at and I'd say, he's a long drive competition guy.
Well, about 15, 20 pounds of muscle ago.
Okay.
I was playing around with a friend of mine, and I drove it like a 365-yard par 4. And
you drove the green?
Yeah, I drove the green. And he said, with just standard equipment, he said, you hit the ball further than anybody I've ever been around. There's a long drive thing. I said, Jerry, I'm not really interested in it. And he talked me into it. And he said, I will pay for a pro to build you a driver if you'll enter this contest. So I did.
With a new driver. And the furthest I hit one that day was 331, but I hit one out of the grid that was about almost 370. Wow.
And the guy that won our round was a guy that, did very well in Long Drive Association. So I went to the regional, and I took 2 allergy pills the day before, which, that makes you jittery as all get out. And so I put one in the grid like 290 and I was done.
Yeah.
But yeah, I got into that for a little while, and it was fun, playing Captain's Choice. People wanted me on their team.
Of course.
We'll
get here in 2 with you off the, off the par 5.
But it was, I played a lot of golf when I was young. I quit because I had a terrible temper. And my dad made me quit, really. And
part of your sanctification process.
It really was, and I picked it back up for fun.
Billy Graham said, he says, my prayers are always answered except on the golf course.
Yeah.
Isn't that the truth?
Scottish Presbyterians invented the game for character development. you always need to remember that.
Well, someone else told me, they said, I don't think this is true, but it's a great line, that golf was created because one man forgot how to ask another man to go on a 4-hour walk together. There's just something about it, So, okay, so what we want to talk about today is, we were just in the story, 2 Kings chapter 5, the story of the healing of Naaman. It's interesting as you read the Bible, there's lots of stories of healing, but then there's other stories where, the Apostle Paul says he has, which we don't know what it is, a thorn in his flesh that he asked the Lord to take away. We know that Jesus Christ comes into the world and he has at least a teaching, preaching, healing ministry, though Jesus did not heal every person in every vicinity of everywhere he went. And sometimes he would go, once or twice, like my memory recalls, the disciples say, hey, there's more people that need taught and preached and healed. And he said, we got to go to the next town. Also, kind of a key verse for me is Exodus 15, verse 26 says this, very early in the Bible, this is God speaking, if you will diligently listen to the voice of the Lord your God and do what is right in his eyes, and give ears to his commandments and all of his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you that I put on the Egyptians. But then here's the key thing. And this is the first time God reveals himself this way. For I am the Lord, your healer. So here's what I want to talk about. I want to talk about your journey, which I'm somewhat familiar with, but I want to get more familiar with today. I want our listeners to get familiar with it. And then just how you've processed decades of pain. Physical pain, because we know also, we can get into this, maybe we'll get into this, we need physical healing. We need spiritual healing. Psalm 147:3 says, the brokenhearted, he heals their wounds. Yes. So we know in our church, there's people that need both. Yeah. Talk to us first about just your journey. Like, in other words, when did you start to have, I don't even know how to, forgive me if I'm not addressing it properly, but when did you begin to have some more serious health concerns? It's been a while, correct?
It's been a long while. Really, beginning in the early 90s, I had some severe digestive things that ultimately ended up me in 2000 having my spleen removed and my stomach reconstructed. But before I had all that done, I had esophageal spasms, which made me choke on food. And pain associated with that. A little sidebar, funny story is that sometimes it would just happen out of the blue. It didn't matter what kind of food I ate. And I would basically have to make myself throw up to not choke. And so I was eating dinner one night and it started happening. And I tried to excuse myself through the garage. And, I stuck my finger down my throat and I felt relief. And my neighbor was weed whacking. And he looked at me and said, hey, man, if her food's not that good, just tell her. And so I said, Jeff, it's not that.
It's not that.
So that began kind of my journey with pain. And so eventually that was resolved through some pretty massive surgery. But then I had like a 3-year period where I didn't have anything, which was glorious.
Amazing.
And then I injured, I had fractured my neck as a stupid young adult sledding. And then I injured my back by my lumbar region by pulling a lawnmower cord, actually.
Oh, wow.
And I ruptured a disc. And so that began my journey with having 2 to 3 two significant back issues, back diseases. And then we found out later I had chronic kidney disease, which is more fatigue than pain, really.
Is that when it's chronic? I mean, is that still going on?
Oh yeah, yeah. I'll live with it the rest of my life unless the Lord heals me. And then I developed about 7 years ago, a mysterious illness with my muscles. Muscular pain and stuff, and so they still haven't diagnosed it accurately yet. So I've been very familiar with chronic pain since the early 90s, with some respite.
Yeah. How are you feeling like today? Here we are.
Hey man, I'm good today.
When I say good, like, okay, if 100% is like how you felt those 3 years, like nothing. I'm 100% if I had to put a percentage on it. An average day like today, how do you feel?
So if I'm below a 5, if you use that scale of 0 to 10,
yeah,
they ask you at the doctor's office. If I'm at a 5 or below, it's a good day. It's very manageable. I have pain.
So you're saying 0 would be the best, and 0 to 5 is a good day.
Yeah.
Anything over 5, you start continue.
Yeah, it starts to kind of interrupt my day in some way or another. And so today, I'm below a 5, and I do that with medicine, and for my back, I have a thing called a spinal stimulator.
We talked about that.
It's a unit. It's kind of like a pacemaker, except it works on my back, and it's wires that go all the way above my lumbar region, and it's really weird. It interrupts the pain signal between the brain and the spine. To some degree, it mutes it. I found out, we got the insurance paper, and it showed the cost of this instrument. It was $103,000. That they put in me. So it's kind of like I got a nice Mercedes Benz in my back, but that helps. It does help.
Well, like I've heard it said before, and I want to try to say this well, but I saw somebody, it was actually on Twitter, but every once in a while there's something helpful on Twitter or X, whatever we call it. And the guy was saying, he said, if you have 10 problems, or if you have 25 problems, or if you have 50 problems, he said, and then you have a health issue, he said, most people then go, I really have one problem. It tends to, I don't know if you would agree with this, all that you've been through, it's like, well, I don't love my job, or, there's a couple hard things in my marriage, or whatever it is. And then all of a sudden you're like, I have a kidney disease that's chronic. So talk to us, like, because here's what I'm thinking. I'm thinking through a lot of people who are listening who aren't going through anything, but we will know somebody who is. Sure. I'm thinking there'll be people listening to this who just got some really bad news for the first time. We had, of course, Katie Kabrick on here with her husband talking about a cancer diagnosis that was at the very beginning of her marriage. She told me the other day, she's had almost no health problems her whole life. They were ready to have kids, and here's cancer.
Right.
And then you've got other people. I've got a dear friend in my community group, and she has all her life had type 1 diabetes. And it's something that she will just, in very godly, very appropriate ways, but just it's probably, we wouldn't go by a month of community group without having a conversation about how that affects her life.
Correct.
Okay, so talk to us about the first, you can just pick one, but think early on, how did you first begin to deal with suffering? What were some ways you look back and go, that was really good, or maybe that was not good? If you look at you back in the 90s, you start to have some of these health concerns. How did you process this as a believer?
Yeah. I mean, I was, obviously not only a Christian, I was a pastor, a church planter. And so experientially, existentially, it was like, it was this daily confrontation with something that wasn't going away, and sometimes would wax and wane by getting worse.
Yeah.
And, been to seminary, had walked with people.
You'd pastored other people who have been hurting.
Yeah. And so, but it really struck me that if God chooses not to heal me, I've got to have a deep reservoir of not only understanding, but peace and strength. It doesn't come from me to not weather it, but to live through it. You know, weathering it is just kind of trying to survive day by day. And sometimes that's not a bad thing, but to insert it into my life. This is God has sovereignly put this in my life.
Yeah.
And not because I've got sin, but because he's up to something that I don't quite understand. And so that's where you dig deep in the Word. And, you know, as I look back, you know, I've had physical suffering. That's one kind. Then there's relational suffering. And then there's kind of mental, emotional suffering. And I know that they're all interwoven, but they're kind of each unique in some ways.
Will you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. I mean, like, so I've dealt with clinical depression in my life. It's been more episodic. But the first time I dealt with that, it was very scary.
Was that connected to a health issue?
It was slightly connected. It was more circumstances in my life at the time. You know, I've gone through what they would call relational social suffering, and then I went through a divorce, which was devastating. So I understood physical suffering. I didn't know how deep emotional suffering could go. And that's where the Psalms, and particularly the Psalms of lament, really deeply touched my life. And I remember that I would take a psalm and I would read it out loud to God. And I remember saying to God, you know, I feel exactly like the writer does. And I need you to show up. I need you to do things to help me not be in the pit of ultimate despair.
Yes.
You know, and there were two occasions, you know, where taking my own life surprisingly felt like a legitimate option. And but the Lord was very, very merciful, and he intervened in some really cool ways in my life through that, to where you know, I have this reservoir of experience now, like 2 Corinthians 1 talks about, that I can encourage people and help people in ways that I couldn't have before. There would have been no way. But you know, you can be surprised by suffering. You can have chronic suffering and get in a rhythm, for a better phrase, with it.
Yeah. This is my life now.
This is my life, and
I'm going to manage it.
I'm factoring it in. I'm not going to let it ruin my day. And then another kind of suffering comes in, and you can feel ill prepared for it. And so you need the strength and help of the Holy Spirit. You need the clarity of Scripture, and you need community. Yeah, big time. And counselors too. You know, to come alongside you and say, you know, you're not abnormal. Many people deal with this, and I contacted a friend of mine, Melly McCutcheon, and she has suffered with lupus for several decades. It's a devastating disease. And so
how does it manifest itself?
It attacks all your major organs. It slowly just ravages them, and there's really no cure for it. And so, but she has not only weathered it, she's been more than an overcomer. So I texted her today. I said, "Hey, we're talking about suffering. Will you pray for me?" And she sent me the sweetest voicemail praying over me about today.
I love it.
But you know, so you can talk to people about that in a way that they understand. You know, that it's like veterans talking about going to war.
Yeah.
You know. They only feel comfortable at a certain level talking to other people who've been in combat.
Experience, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, how about you mentioned community? So talk about maybe first talk about your wife and maybe how she's come alongside you, or your family, your children, or is it, or even if you feel comfortable, you know, it doesn't have to be our church, but just Christians in the past. What? Because I think, and I've said this before, but I think Christians, maybe especially those of us who have not suffered as deeply, we don't often know what to do.
Yeah. And so it's the ministry of presence. It's a overworn phrase, I'm sure, but especially if you have a chronic illness of some sort. There's no fix apart from the Lord, deciding to heal you. And so a lot of people want to help sincerely, and they'll say, hey, I read this, online. Have you tried this unique diet? And you go like, yeah, I probably won't be doing that. I like Snickers too much. And, but for instance, my wife is, I'll brag on her for a moment. She's a world-class medical researcher. And so, and she's the most left-brain woman I've ever met in my life. So she is a fixer, to the extreme. And so when we first started connecting, I thought, I don't know if I really need to be in a dating relationship, because I don't know, I wasn't doing well with my kidney disease. I don't know if I need to latch this onto somebody else. Yeah, I get it. And so we were talking about the purpose-driven life, and I think day 6 or 7 talks about life as a temporary assignment. And I thought that would be a perfect segue for me to say to her, look, let's just kind of remain friends. I don't think I want to put this on anybody else. Yeah. And she came, loaded for bear. And, she said, listen, I don't want you to talk that way. I'm going to take care of you the rest of your life. Wow. And I was just blown away. Powerful. Yeah. And, it was just a manifestation of the mercy of God. And so she's been a constant, she has. We don't think about, I was talking with somebody about this the other day, we don't think about how chronic illness affects the mate.
Talk about that. That's a big deal, because I've seen some situations. I've seen a situation before where a guy becomes paralyzed. Yeah. Extreme example, but and it completely, of course, changes everything. And the wife became the everything. Yeah. For 20 years. Yeah. Yeah. And
how
do we minister to people ministering to the people?
They need respite. They need, in extreme cases like that, they need, I think the biggest thing that I've discovered, and especially lately, is that I need to show my wife empathy. We like receiving empathy, when we're struggling with chronic illness, but I need to show her empathy and grace, when she gets frustrated with me or something, in that, she's burdened by it. Yeah. And, she's the one that's taken me to the emergency rooms, or called the ambulance. And so, but she kind of keeps things inside. Gina's, is a very private person. And so, I told her, I said, you might need to talk to somebody sometime just about how you're feeling other than me, just to kind of have a release valve. But they need friends, Christian friends, to talk to that would not be judgmental. They say, hey, Walker's wearing me out. He's driving me crazy.
And sometimes maybe they feel bad because they're like, well, part of this is he's dealing with his own illness. And so I feel bad, that I'm worn out because he's going through something.
Yeah, I went through one phase a while back where I was immobilized for 3 months, basically. And so, she didn't have to do, I could get up and down, but it was like, it was the bed, it was the chair, and, she works from home, and she's the hardest working human being I've ever met in my life. And so it was like she was trying to attend to me, and I was like, I feel like I'm a burden, you know. And so having Christian friends to talk through about that is huge for people like that.
How about prayer, in the sense of, obviously you're in prayer, you're being honest with God, like the Psalms are, like Job is. Yeah. But you've been dealing with this at different levels for so long. How do you continue to pray for healing? Do you do that? Because I'm thinking of certain situations in which, when somebody first gets some diagnosis, I love this about our church and other churches. The prayer warriors come out of the room, and they say that we're praying for full healing. Yeah. And we're praying, I've done versions like that. We're going to pray like charismatics for this, and I love that. I don't want less of that. How has your prayers for your healing changed? Have they? Versus, it's 1995, you find out you got something, and you're like, okay, I'm let me find the passages, let me find the promises. So two parts of the question. What does your prayer life look like, and how has it changed? And the other is there any certain passages, you mentioned the Psalms, passages that you go to?
Yeah, so I don't mind praying like a 4-year-old, for anything.
I love that.
Childlike, just really simple, gut level honesty with God, out loud.
It's helpful.
You know,
Yeah, it's real.
But I think the biggest way my prayers have changed through the lens of suffering is that I'm seeking for how I'm growing through it. I'm more sensitive in my prayers to asking God to show me what He's up to in my life.
Yeah.
Versus just a simple transactional thing of being healed, you know. And, you know, Hebrews 5 talks about Jesus learned obedience through suffering, which I still can't wrap my head around that verse. You know, it's just, you know, it's a mysterious verse to me.
It is.
You know, Him being fully God, you know, and fully man. But so, you know, what do I need to learn through suffering? God's not masochistic. He's not saying, well, Walker, I'm going to give you suffering so you might learn a lesson. It's not that transactional. It's transformational, you know. And He's like, I read a quote today from Mother Teresa where, you know, a lot of people, I don't know if they understand what her calling originally was specifically to go to the least of the least of the least of India, the lowest caste, and minister to the dying. I
don't think I knew the last part.
Yeah. I mean, she was called to minister to the dying.
I'm going to the least and the last, and I'm going to minister to those who are dying.
That was her initial calling.
Wow.
And you think, well, that's kind of defeatist. What are you doing? She felt this overwhelming leadership of God, and she said that suffering is the kiss of Jesus. And I thought, now that's different.
That's a different
perspective. But she saw it every single day.
Oh, man.
You know, for 5 decades, 6 decades. So, you know, for the Christian, you know, we're to rejoice in suffering, not for it, but in it. And when I practice that, because it's almost like a spiritual discipline to do it, you know.
Well said. Yeah.
That when I practice that, I have to be honest. My understanding opens up. My wells of compassion grow deeper. I'm less judgmental of people, and it doesn't even relate to suffering directly. It's just that you don't know what most people are going through, and if you did, you would pause. And so. And then, you know, I can pick up on people that are dealing with things more accurately. My radar is more accurate and sensitive to people that are struggling now, you know, spidey sense.
Yeah, there you go. Your spiritual suffering spidey sense. There you go.
Yeah.
Are you able to see, like, because you've been in this for decades, are you able to see right now some of God's purposes in your suffering? Does that make sense? Because Job, you know, when I think about the story of Job, I'm like, we know so much that Job didn't know. We get from what we can tell from the text, he doesn't know all these purposes in his suffering. He doesn't know about the conversation with Satan. He doesn't know how God's defending him and withholding things. But sometimes in this life, we don't always get to see all that.
That's right.
What have you been able to see some purpose in the pain?
Yeah, I think that, like I just said earlier, that you know, Paul said in 2 Corinthians 12, you know, he asked the Lord 3 times, you know, whatever that thorn was, you know. I don't like to speculate, you know, but it was something significant.
Yeah.
And because look at all this guy suffered through, you know. In the earlier verses, he had this list where you go, how did he get through that?
Yeah.
Where he just didn't go check out and said, that's enough, you know. This is too hard.
Yeah.
So he didn't. He drove deeper into the kingdom work. And he, you know, that prayer, you know, God said to him, my grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. And for me, the way I interpret that is that Paul suddenly had another capability added to his arsenal, if you will, of ministering to people.
Yeah. And
so for me, the immediate thing is, you know, I can talk to people, you know, eyeball to eyeball, heart to heart about suffering. And in a way that, you know, it's not defeatist. It's not like, oh yeah, we all suffer, you know, sorry, you're in the club now.
Yeah.
It's more like, you know, God is, you know, a verse that meant a lot to me. Psalm 73:26 says, my flesh and my heart may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever. And so that verse doesn't say you're going to get healed.
Yeah.
Right. And so my physical capabilities and even my will, because a lot of times, in the self-help books, it talks about how to empower your will to overcome things and stuff. But I can tell you that the will has a limit of strength. And so what happens when your will runs out of gas? Well, God is underneath that, underneath our everlasting arms. So, and so there have been times where the presence of the Lord has been overwhelming in a good way. And I'm aware of what Romans 8 talks about, is that, the Spirit intercedes for us with groanings. And I feel like there are times that I've entered into that flow, and that I'm aware that God is his sovereign purposes and his monstrous love are real. They're realities. They're not just theologies we construct. They're real things that move us through life.
Yeah.
And so that's how it's impacted me. So compassion and a deeper awareness of God's presence. I would say those two things.
Yeah. I mean, we've known each other for a while, but you feel like the kind of person, if I was going through something, I mean, you'd be on the top of my list. I'm like, I don't even know what kind of suffering. I feel like Walker's he's not going to judge me. He's not going to think he's better than me. He's not going to give me flowery answers, any of that. But you'd be the kind of guy that we, could walk through.
Sure.
I've kind of asked this already, but to ask it a different way, because you may get at something different that might be important for me to learn and for listeners to learn. How do you go through suffering and it not make you bitter? Because I see people when they go through suffering and they become a bitter person. They, I've heard it said the number one thing I heard Sinclair Ferguson say this. The number one thing people do in assisted living homes is complain.
Well, I believe that.
And they complain about their food, and they complain about the service, and they complain about everything, and they just I'm not saying every person, but they become this. And then, it could be easy for somebody through suffering, whether it's physical suffering, whether it's church hurt. We see, hopefully a lot of people have your experience, which draws you closer to the Lord, but we see people, it pushes them away from the Lord. I don't know if it's, Mark 4 in some ways, the thorns, and the sun comes up and, you know what I'm saying?
Yes.
Versus, Keller says, pleasure can push people away from God, but so can pain.
Yeah, both.
How does that work? How has suffering made you better, not bitter?
So, I think it's okay to be initially bitter. You just can't stay there.
Yeah. Well, a lot of Psalms start that way.
Yeah. I mean, what was it? Psalm 86, I think it's 86 or 89, I can't remember. It ends with, and darkness is my best friend. That's how the Psalm ends. And you go like, there is no feel-good theology here.
I'm not super encouraged by this.
There's I don't see certain health, wealth, and prosperity preachers preaching through the Psalm. And so, confessing to God and wrestling with him of saying, I don't understand this. I feel like my sin account is clean with you, that I've repented of sin that I know of. I don't know of any broken relationships I haven't tried to fix. You go through, you do go through a checklist.
Yeah, I've talked about that before. You'll scour your conscience. Is there anything I need to do? Yep.
And then once you go through that, you go at the end of it's like, okay, so I'm not happy. I'm not happy about this. And not only am I not happy about it, I'm angry with you, God, because I don't get it.
Yeah.
And then there's something about the goodness and mercy of God to where he welcomes that. He welcomes honest discourse.
Yes.
And he sits with us, to use a metaphor, with it. And I think that's why, God rebuked the friends of Job so strongly.
Yes.
Is that, he was saying, not only is their theology of suffering wrong, they don't understand, what me and Job understand.
That's right.
So I think you first say, you get really gut level honest with God. And then what you do.
I love that phrase, by the way, gut level honest.
And then you get out of you get out of your chair, you get out of your house, you go minister to people who are struggling. You've got to get out of your own head. I think you mentioned this before about spiritual depression and D. Martin Lloyd-Jones when he said, you don't listen to yourself, talk to yourself.
That's right.
Psalm 42. And so I think, understanding that people are worse off than you got to get, go minister to people, plug your, we'll make a shameless plug, plug yourself in the community group, listen to other people's stories. I like asking other people questions. People ask, hey, Walker, I was just with my DNA group before I got here.
Yeah.
Like, hey, Walker, and okay, at some point I go, enough of me. So I want to hear Steve, what's going on with you?
That's right.
What about this? And Doug, what's happening with you about this? But ministering to people is huge in getting out of bitterness. And then you got to have accountability partners who will say, hey, that's enough, man. My wife sometimes does it. She goes like, okay, I mean, that's the third time you said that today.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
I mean,
it's the first 2 times I was okay with it, but get up.
Yeah. And the Lord really spoke to me a year ago out of the story of the lame guy about the pool of Bethesda, where Jesus says, take up your mat and walk. There's something about that passage that day I read. It really struck me about this. Some aspect of my healing is moving. It's just moving. It's getting up and moving. It's moving forward.
That's a good word.
I'll never get full healing. I'm not expecting it. That's what a resurrected body looks like.
That's right. That's right. We'll end by talking about that.
Yeah.
The guy who did our premortal counseling, he was probably about how old you are right now. He'd had a lot of ministry experience, and he was so proud of himself. He'd done like so many weddings, and he said, no, none of them ever, ended in divorce. He was all, but I will never forget this session. He talked about, he said in marriage, he said, you're going to get angry at each other in this thing. And then he said, you can suppress it. That's not unhealthy. He said, you can express it. He said, and that may not always be healthy for your spouse. But then he said, you can always express it or confess it to God. Mm-hmm. He's like, God, and he took us to a couple of these Psalms. Mm-hmm. And he's like, God can handle it. Mm-hmm. You got to sometimes, get in your confessional booth. Let's even say, put the curtain down. Say, she's staying out, he's staying out. And just, and again, in a way that he's the sovereign Lord of the universe, but just be completely gut level honest with God. Two other things I want to talk about, and then I want to end with those books. One is I think a question that we get a lot, and it starts when I dealt with this recently on a podcast, but it starts when someone has some anxiety maybe or some depression, and they start to wonder, how much of this is spiritual? How much of this is medical? How do you think? I mean, we live in a time, obviously if it's 500 years ago, it's like, we're going to pray about this and hope God shows up, because there's no anesthesia, there's no surgery, there's nothing. Nowadays we have this amazing, even the story of Naaman, it's like, from, again, I'm no expert, I'm no doctor. From what I read today, it's like, we now have the right treatments to treat what would be considered modern leprosy. Yeah. Like it doesn't have, it doesn't have to end in death. Yeah. How have you thought through the role of like, man, I need prayer. Is there any repentance in my heart? What does the word of God say? What promises can I claim? What role is this in just like, I'm called to suffer and we're going to suffer? And then modern medical science. Because I know you've tried a lot of things. How have you thought about that? Because that is, I think, where a lot of people are when they get it. Yeah. They're like, they finally get the diagnosis or something. They're like, do I go deep spiritual? Do I go deep medical? Talk to us about that.
So we're stewards over our body, right? We're not creators of it. And we won't be recreators of it. I've read all these books on health. You go through these phases where you just go, I've read the book, it's like 900 pages, a book called Outlive. You look at diets, and there's validity in all of it to a degree. And so I believe in medical assistance, but I've learned, without becoming cynical, right? I've learned that medical help can only go so far. In its best applications.
I get it.
Even its best.
And we're in a city of medicine, but I get it.
Oh man. And so what I do is I want to have a healthy expectation of doctors. Whether I'm talking to a doc that's going to give me something for depression, for a short-term treatment plan, or whether I'm going in for another back injection or surgery, I've just learned to lower my expectations to the degree that if it helps more than I anticipated, that's great. But the thing I have to live with is the spiritual stuff. the journey part of my illness, not the intervention part of my illness. That's very short term. The journey part of my illness, I've got, I try to have a coach or counselor in my life, even at my age. I just got, some people call them spiritual directors. I just got a guy from the Nashville area that I've hooked up with. And
love it.
Because, I'm not done yet. And there are people I can learn from, sometimes they're younger guys, right? And so I want to make sure that I'm growing. And so that way, when I use medical intervention, it's supplemental.
Yeah, it's good.
It's supplemental versus that, you can go in a hole like you wouldn't believe about looking at every theory, about everything, about how to treat your body. And it's endless. It's endless. And then it becomes oppressive.
Oh, yeah.
Because you don't know, you wonder, what am I doing wrong? Am I too far gone? What diet should I do now? To the point, instead of saying, I want to manage my body well,
yeah,
to where, it can become a form of idolatry, I think, in some cases.
Think so. Yeah.
And I've just said, I just want to have healthy expectation of doctors and dietitians and, and then I'm going to live my life out. When we were on a trip to Greece, I forgot my charger for my back thing, and my wife was just ticked off at me. But I told her, I said, you know what, I'll just double up my medication. I'm not going to let this ruin the trip.
Yeah.
And so there was a mindset I had where I'm going to have fun.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
And I'm going to enjoy myself even if I'm in pain. And it's amazing how just that little adjustment attitudinally, without the charger. So my back stimulator was offline for the whole trip, basically. And I had to recharge it when I got home. But the point being is that I was kind of amazed. I still was in a lot of pain. I was a little grumpy, a little on edge. But overall, Gina was amazed, and I was amazed that I was able to maintain. And it was the goodness of the Lord, but part of it was just attitudinally.
Yes. Yeah. All right. Last question before I want you to tell us about some good resources. Yes, last question is, how does this change how you think about the future in the sense of the resurrection, heaven? I think when people are young, maybe, or healthy, or young and healthy especially, we read 1 Corinthians 15 about a new body, or, we read, because it's interesting, when I was teaching through, is it 1 Corinthians where Paul, it's either 1 or 2 Corinthians, where, it might be 2 Corinthians, where Paul talks about being a tent.
Yes. 2 Corinthians 5. Yeah. 2
Corinthians 5. Mm-hmm. Well, 2 Corinthians 4 is jar of clay. So you've got two entire chapters where Paul just goes after the experience in a body. Yeah. And you think about, as you said, in 2 Corinthians 11, all that Paul went through. Yeah. And I've always said that I think the more somebody suffers, if they're Christian, the more, and if they're suffering well, the more their heart is in heaven.
Yes.
And the more people that they love that have died,
the
more their heart is in heaven.
Yes.
Tell us just how you think about it. Obviously, Lord willing, you have a lot of time left here still, and grateful for that. How is the hope of heaven, the hope of resurrection, the hope of a new body, how does that practically help you today?
So, I think health, when taken out of context, can be an opiate for delaying the inevitable reality of death. And what I mean by that is that, when all cylinders are firing and you're in great health, you hear about the resurrection, in a new body, but it's just theoretical.
That's right.
In a lot of ways. But when you hit that first real stop physically, and you work through any cynicism or bitterness, and you get that out of your heart, and you're really humble before the Lord, I think the Lord puts a deeper longing in you for heaven, and a deeper longing particularly for when the new heaven and the new earth, comes together and you get a resurrected body.
Yeah.
and you think, you use your sanctified imagination. You start thinking, man, how cool would that be? And so you can speak that into people. When my dad was dying of pancreatic cancer, I was in the hospital room with him. And he was resting. And I was reading 2 Corinthians 5. And my dad said, "What you reading there, bud?" I said, 2 Corinthians 5. He said, "Read it to me." And I just read the Bible to him. It wasn't like any commentary. It was talking about the tent and the tabernacle.
Oh, yeah.
And my dad said, "I didn't realize that was in the Bible." He said, "Whew, what a relief." And I said, "That is right, Dad. It's a relief."
That's right.
That there's more to this life than, a decaying body. And if you live long enough, you learn that. I think I looked at, there was an actuarial table that said like only 8 to 10% of people die suddenly and the rest of us die slowly.
Yeah.
And
I think it was R.C. Sproul who said, "I'm not afraid of death, I'm afraid of dying."
Yeah, I remember him saying that, But I think that, the hope of the resurrection is not just the cessation of suffering. That's cool. But it's being clothed with immortality.
That's a word. That's good. You're preaching.
Yeah, that's well, yeah. I mean,
but you're right.
Yeah, I mean, okay, I want to avoid the bad. Well, it's not just the bad.
Yeah,
you get the good.
That's right.
Too.
Yeah. Well, tell us about these books.
Sure.
Because I'm very because and as you do that, let me say this: one of my favorite professors in seminary, Dr. Robert Jones, who actually recently quoted again. He said, when somebody's going through suffering, he says, "I want you to take a book on suffering, and I want you to burn it in the fire." Right next to them so they can feel the warmth. But he said they're often the books that you need before you suffer.
Yeah.
And again, God uses it in suffering.
Yeah, absolutely.
But talk to us about some people who they want to better minister to people who are suffering, or they just want to, they want to, it's either 1st or 2nd Peter where he says, "Do not think it's strange when you suffer."
Oh, yeah.
And so we want to prepare. Tell us a little bit about each book and why you liked it.
So, obviously I would say God's Word.
Yeah.
Is our foundation. And it's weird that when you're going through suffering, there are Bible passages that light up for some reason that never lit up to you before. I
believe it.
And you just go like, I had no idea that was in the Bible, like my dad said. So this book is called The Deepest Place by Kurt Thompson, who's a Christian psychiatrist. It's got a podcast and everything. This is really about...
I've never heard of this book.
Yeah.
Tell me about it.
This book is really, he integrates neuroscience. He's a brilliant, godly man. But this is really about how suffering is spiritual formation. More than any other book I've read on this before, he does a great job in really going, and he takes Romans 5, 1-5, and he just unfolds that, which is brilliant. And then this book was written by a guy named Kelly Kapik.
Okay, I've heard of him. What's the name of this book?
So this is Embodied Hope.
Okay.
And he wrote this book partially because his wife struggles with chronic illness. And so it's very, very close to home. And this is just really brilliantly, if someone was struggling with chronic illness, or you're ministering to someone with chronic illness, or you're a pastor and you're doing this to me is the go-to book to think through about chronic illness. Particularly. And the last one, of course, this is one
you can't end without talking about, this is the one I have read.
Yeah. And this, from a comprehensive perspective about suffering and the Christian life, this is the best book I've read from just a general kind of over, walking with God through pain and suffering. I mean, if you're a pastor and you've got these 3 books, you are armed.
I love it. So Tim Keller, of course, I've read that one. And what I loved about that, like, only Keller can do, who's now with the Lord, who went through his own suffering, and who said when he got pancreatic cancer, he reread, of course, he's a complete Bible nerd. He rereads N.T. Wright's tome on the resurrection. And the way he described it was the gospel dropped a few more levels in his soul because he needed it. But what I appreciate about him is he's so good at going, I can't remember all the categories, but here's a secular view of suffering. Yeah. Here's a Buddhist view of suffering, or whatever. And you're just like, man, Christianity is one of the only religions, maybe the only, certainly in the most true sense, the only religion that says there is a purpose in the pain. There's a lesson in the loss. Yes. God's doing so. Because I do think that one of the things that will make us go crazy is pointless suffering. It's like there is no point. And I think that's why, you've got the rise of assisted suicide, which is, it's too painful, turn it off.
Oh, yeah.
So
Yeah.
I love all these books. If you would, so let's just go over one more time. Tim Keller, big kind of overview.
Yeah.
Kelly
and very accessible, for anybody. Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering by Timothy Keller.
And you can almost, that book, in my opinion, doesn't necessarily even need to be read in order. You could go and go, this chapter is really interesting.
Oh, you can bounce around.
Yeah, bounce around that.
Yeah.
This one is, the embodied one is about, remind me one more time?
It's really about chronic illness and suffering.
That's a big one. Okay. Yeah.
And it's written from a personal perspective of what he and his wife.
And of somebody who's had to take care of somebody who's chronic ill. And then the final one is spiritual formation.
It's really about how God uses suffering to make us like Christ.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I did not know you before your suffering, but I've known you through your suffering. You've been like Christ. I've appreciated I remember there was a season, I don't know how many years ago, where you just came and we met and you just said, I'm really going through something and I need, and I apprecited that. It was all physical, but it's spiritual, it's emotional. And so I've appreciated your friendship. I've appreciated your investment. The way that God has used you and will continue to use you to minister to those who are suffering. And I think that's exactly part of what I hope happened in this podcast today. So if you're listening, I would encourage you to check out any of those 3 books, and as well as, we didn't mention, anything by Joni Eareckson Tada.
Oh, yeah.
She has created an entire ministry ministering to those who are suffering.
Yes.
I will see you next week on Open Bible, Open Life.